We hear these complaints. We hear, well, this agreement doesn't do this, doesn't stop their terror. This agreement's going to give them some money. This agreement's going to do this. What this agreement is supposed to do is stop them from having a nuclear weapon. Now, I want to hear somebody tell me how they're going to do that.
We're going to go
without
to
this agreement.
Mr.
I'd like
Secretary,
to know how you
we're going to go to Mr. William Keating of Massachusetts. The gentleman's time's expired.
They have an ability to go enrich again. What's the next step for the United States? Nobody's answering that question.
That was Secretary of State John Kerry challenging Congress to offer a better approach to Iran's nuclear ambitions. Joining us from Capitol Hill, member of the Armed Services Committee, Republican Senator Dan Sullivan of Alaska.
So, Senator, we'll ask you the question. Good morning. Thank you for being with us. We'll go ahead and just throw that question from the Secretary of State to you. What's the better alternative to this deal?
Well, look, I think there's plenty of better alternatives. And, you know, there's this idea that it's disagreement or war, and I just simply don't accept that. Let me give you 3 examples of what the alternatives could be. First of all, you know, a lot of people have overlooked there was a civil nuclear agreement with UAE, with the United Arab Emirates, that was completed in 2009. It was considered the gold standard in the region by everybody who was part of it, the Bush administration, the Obama administration, and it did not allow for any enrichment capabilities or facilities. We can go back to an agreement like that, which, you know, one of our closest allies in the region, the UAE, agreed to, and in many ways it was set up to make sure Iran would agree to something similar. John Kerry rejected that. He said the Iranians wouldn't agree to that. Second, on sanctions. You know, Secretary Kerry is saying, hey, if the international community is not part of sanctions, that's it. Well, that's not true. I've been involved in the Bush administration in terms of our sanctions, unilateral sanctions from the United States, if it relates to the energy sector, if it relates in particular to the financial community, global financial community. We still have tremendous power, even if we have to go it alone on sanctions. And finally, you know, what we haven't had at all in this administration, and Secretary Kerry even implied it in his testimony yesterday, we need a comprehensive strategy on Iran. We have been so focused on the issue of the nuclear agreement, we have not focused on them being the largest state sponsor of terrorism, human rights, ballistic missiles. I think there's plenty of options.
All right, Mike.
Senator, you've said in your statement here, and I quote, the primary responsibility of the president and of those of us in Congress is to keep our country safe. The president seems to have forgotten this. How has the President of the United States forgotten our safety?
Well, look, Mike, first of all, you got to remember the president is not only forgetting it, both he and John Kerry have been very dismissive of the role of Congress and the American people in this agreement. You know, we're having these hearings today. Had it been up to the president and John Kerry, 2 former members of the Senate, we wouldn't even be having these hearings. They did not want the American people or the Congress to weigh in. I think the way the president has not been focused on keeping America safe, at the beginning of these negotiations, everybody agreed. And there is a letter from 81 members of the U.S. Senate to the president last March 2014 that said the goal of this agreement has to be to dismantle Iran's nuclear capability and to prevent it from ever having a pathway to the bomb. That was the agreed upon goal by everybody, including the administration, and we've abandoned that.
All right. Speaking of that letter, I think the other point of view could be that Congress has been really dismissive of the president in this process and almost gotten in the way of any progress. Harold?
Senator, good morning. The fundamental question asked by Secretary Kerry is, if not this deal, how do we ensure, and I hear you saying the sanctions have worked, but if the sanctions have been on Iran this long period of time, and yet they have found themselves still enriching uranium, how do you answer the secretary who then believes if we believe sanctions alone will work, that we may be the only country imposing those sanctions because our allies will drop off? Will the sanctions still, or would sanctions still have the impact that you imagine?
Well, look, Harold, I mean, one thing you have to look at is the interest of the different countries. Secretary Kerry has stated many times or implied that we're going to be isolated. Remember, at the beginning of these negotiations, Iran was the country that was isolated. They were the pariah state. Now to imply that the Congress is isolated, I think is dismissive of not only the Congress, but the American people. And there's also this statement that every other country in the world agrees with this deal. Well, that's not true. Countries that have an economic interest, Europeans, Russians, China, they certainly have an economic interest in terms of agreeing to this. The countries that actually have a deep security interests on this issue, the Gulf Arab states, Israel, they're not in agreement. So I don't believe that it's us versus the world. To the contrary, a lot of countries still have huge questions about the security of this agreement.
All right, Senator Dan Sullivan, thank you so much. We greatly appreciate you being with us. Hope you come back.
Thank you.
Up next.